Welcome to the Conversations That Matter podcast. We are live now, and I have a guest with me, Zach Garris. Zach has been on the program before. He serves as the pastor of Bryce Avenue Presbyterian Church in White Rock, New Mexico, and he is the author of Masculine Christianity and Honor Thy Fathers, Recovering the Anti-Feminist Theology of the Reformers. I actually saw, Zach, the cover for this today or yesterday on New Christendom Press. It looks pretty good. So when does that come out?
June sometime. I know the guy said it will be available at the conference in Ogden, Utah.
Yeah.
But I don't know when it will be available online. But I assume sometime in the month of June.
Yeah, the only bone I have to pick is it says endorsements from This Is Foster, Stephen Wolfe, C.R. Wiley, and I'm pretty sure that I read and endorsed this. So we'll see. We'll see the cover.
Yeah. I assuom it will be somewhere in the book or online. They'll use your.
I may not have made the cut. It's okay, Zach. So anyway, no, this is really good, and we could talk about so many things. But I saw an article that you put out there recently in American Reformer called "Petitioning the Magistrate." I remember this is kind of an old issue, isn't it? Or like it's not a hot issue right this second. You're responding to something that already happened. Now, of course, David Gordon, I guess, is who you're responding to, and he wrote an article last month. But correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't this issue like last year? Wasn't this a big deal?
Yes, that's correct. Well, actually, you've kind of had 2 years in a row where the PCA has sent up a petition to the civil government. So you had abortion in 2022, and then this petition 2023. So the General Assembly, June of last year, the PCA General Assembly passed the overture to petition the civil government, the magistrate, on transgender surgeries, especially on minors. So it's not limited to minors; it's broader than that. But they had to write the letter. So the letter was written. I think it came out early this year. And 2024.
So initially
January or something.
Wasn't there was someone prominent at Escondido, right? That was objecting to this and saying that this is a conflation of the kingdoms or something.
Yeah. So back when this was an issue at the Assembly, R. Scott Clark, who's a professor of church history at Westminster Seminary, California, in Escondido, he was critical of the Assembly's move, and his argument was that it violates, or part of his argument, it violates Westminster Confession 31.4, which deals with petitioning the magistrate, and the language is like cases extraordinary. So we can get into that, but
yeah. Well,
and then that ties into this protest here by T. David Gordon, who
to set the stage, because I probably did a poor job of that in the beginning here. We're talking about, this is the first issue. We're going to get into some more PCA issues since you're a PCA pastor, Zach. But we're talking about the PCA decided to take a public stand, and not just take a public stand, but urge the civil magistrate essentially to, what's the best way to put it? To not sanction or to not approve of transgender surgeries for minors. That's basically the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, the language is the Assembly petitioned the civil government to stop transgender surgery, so to outlaw them, to put an end to them. So it's calling the government to do something. I mean, so it's condemning the very practice of transgender surgeries as
and all of God's people said, why is this controversial? But with certain people in the PCA, it is. And some of these guys, I would say they're probably the radical two kingdoms guys, right? They really just see, and so let's talk about, maybe give the concrete examples first, so you can go through what you talked about in your article, and then maybe explain like what drives them, what makes them tick, because this is such an odd, I think, to the average Christian way of approaching the topic, that the church can never ever speak prophetically, and the two kingdoms shall never, the waters don't ever mix. So go ahead.
To be clear, these guys are not necessarily political leftists.
Right.
I'm not saying they're paleoconservatives. They might be neoconservatives, but politically they're not usually leftists. They're making an argument that gets into the proper duties of church and state and separation of church and state. And it gets into what's known as the spirituality of the church, which we can get into. But just to be clear, that's what they're arguing is not, nobody here is arguing that transgender surgeries are a good thing. They are, so to be fair to them, they're saying that the church should not speak to the state on this matter formally. And particularly T. David Gordon's argument as part of his protest is that it's the General Assembly that should not be doing this, or he would say church courts. So he would allow, he even allowed in his article, he allows for pastors to preach against these things. So I mean, that's another issue, but he's not even saying it has to stay out of the pulpit per se. He's just saying that when we come together in church courts, which would be elders gathering as a session, or presbytery meetings, or the highest we have in the PCA is the General Assembly, he's saying that we should not make political rulings. That's what he's saying. He's saying it's a political ruling. I don't think it's, I would argue it's not purely political. So that's where
how prominent is David Gordon in the PCA? I mean, he was a professor at Gordon college in there in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to remember the
Grove
name
City.
now. Grove City.
College, yeah.
Gordon. Grove City. And then, of course, he's a minister in the PCA. Is he pretty prominent? I suppose prominent enough for you to write against his position.
Yes, he's retired now. I think he's fairly well known in like Reformed circles. Most people probably know him for his book, Why Johnny Can't Preach.
Oh yes, okay, I do know.
But that's where I had first heard of him. Is he's critical of kind of modern evangelicalism and that book's like Lack of Education and the like. So yeah, I mean, I remember liking that book. It's been a while since I read it, but
well, walk us through his argument then, and why you disagree with his position on this.
Yeah, so Gordon basically he has kind of three arguments in there. That's how I summarize his article. Let me actually maybe backtrack. So his presbytery, the Ascension Presbytery in Pennsylvania, they sent up the petition to the local government. Okay, so to the state. That's how he filed his protest in his presbytery. And so that's why it's a recent issue, is the presbyteries can, if they choose, send up the petition, the letter to civil government. They can send it to more local government instead of the PCA only sent it to, I believe, the federal government, different people within federal government. So anyway, so Gordon protested, and he has some arguments in here that are like, hey, this just isn't a good use of time and resources, which I think that's hard to say at this point. It's kind of what I say at the beginning of the article. But because to be fair, so he advocates that, well, individuals can send up these letters. He's not saying we can't send up letters to government on these issues as individual pastors or church members or whatever. So again, though, I don't think that's really a strong argument, because I do think when the assembly does this, takes a stand, it's saying, hey, this is a serious thing, and it's actually encouraging other people to do those individual petitions and letters. That's fine. I wouldn't pit them against each other. And I just think transgender surgeries, it's such a massive, problem, but just so awful. And it's something that I think the church should clearly speak against. And so it's good that we have a statement like this. So I'm not with him on his argument that it's not a good use of time or resources. It's obviously not the only thing we should be doing as a church, but I don't think we spent that much time on it, frankly. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So that's argument one then. And that's more of a prudential, just there's other priorities and stuff. That's not a deeply theological argument. What are the other two? Right.
So he's getting at a more theological issue, which I'm I'm going to look at the wording here just so I can be clear with what he said. So he's affirming the spirituality of the church, which I would affirm, but there is disagreement as to how this plays out and kind of its details. And some of this, I should say, just as a note, goes back to some debates in the 19th century between Presbyterians like Charles Hodge. There was James Henley Thornwell, but I really think the most radical guy was Stuart Robinson, Kentucky Presbyterian. So this gets into some of, and we can talk about this, some of the difference between like Hodge and Robinson. So Gordon says that the spirituality of the church, that is, its spiritual, non-political nature, forbids a joint church assembly from speaking to the civil magistrate. That's kind of his general principle, is that the church should not, and its courts and its joint assemblies, which, as I said, session, presbytery, general assembly, should not make rulings that involve politics. And he seems to say that even when they're touching on moral issues. So that therein lies part of the problem, is that's, I would agree with him if we're talking about something that's purely political, and there we see part of the problem. But so then tied with this, he does make an exception to that general principle, which is that the church can speak to the civil government if the magistrate makes a request. So if the government says, "Hey, church, can you speak to us on this issue?" and then the church is then allowed to do so because they're requested to do so. Or the other exceptions, that's one. The second exception is that the church can make humble petitions in cases extraordinary. And so this gets into Westminster Confession 31.4. And so I realize some of this is, gets tedious, but essentially he's arguing that cases extraordinary, and he's citing A.A. Hodge, which is Charles Hodge's son. Hodge says, quote, "where the interests of the church are immediately concerned." And so Gordon is using A.A. Hodge's short comment, by the way, it's pretty brief, in support of his position that it needs to basically directly interfere with the church. So he's not saying that the church can never petition the state. He's saying it just should be only when the church, the state directly affects the church. And I think he gives the example of like some of the COVID shutdowns. So he would allow for something there, like where it interferes with the church, and then the church can petition the state. But he's saying that the transgender stuff doesn't directly affect the church. And so basically we just need to stay out of it.
Okay. All right. So that's well summarized there. It's not an extraordinary case. It doesn't directly affect the church. Well, or if it is, it doesn't directly affect the church. And your disagreement is?
Yeah. So, well, I have several disagreements. As I mentioned, I think this issue is not purely political. So if we were talking about, I don't know, I always like to say like tariff rates or something, then the church probably shouldn't get involved. It's something that is purely political and should be decided as a political matter, and it's not a spiritual religious issue. And so the church should just stay out of it. It causes problems, and it's just not the church's duty. But I think the church in its joint courts can and should at times speak to the magistrate regarding moral issues. And this is a moral issue, though it touches somewhat on the duties of the state. And so, yeah, I think Gordon has a problem basically where he's and this gets into the language of chapter 31.4 of the confession. It speaks of ecclesiastical affairs and then civil affairs. The problem is that something like transgender surgeries, Well, what does that fall under? It's not purely a civil affair because it's a moral issue. And so in that sense, it can relate to the church. I mean, we can apply the Bible to these things. So that's part of it. Is the scriptures do speak to these issues, and therefore, if the scriptures speak to them, the church can speak to them. And in some ways, the church has a duty to speak to them, right? When they're a problem in society, we have a duty to apply the word of God. And so he's basically, I think Gordon's tying the church's hands behind its back, saying we can't address these things publicly, or at least not as in church courts. I think it's kind of arbitrary, where he says you could do it from a pulpit, but not from a church court. I don't see a distinction, because if I can do it from the pulpit, then the church courts can do it. And if I can't do it from the pulpit, if I can't, then church courts can't. I think we should see some consistency there. I'm not sure exactly his basis. He doesn't seem to explain that. So that's part of my objection, is just this is a moral issue that the church can, and in this case should speak to. It's permissible. And I mean, also, you know, if you see my opening argument in that article, it's basically, I say this is absurd. It's actually an absurd position to say the church as the church cannot speak to condemn transgender surgeries and call the state to do something about it. I mean, if we can't do it, who's going to speak to it? Nobody else. And so we're just going to, you know, let evil take place in the open, and the church is just going to be silent. I think that's entirely unacceptable.
Yeah. Why don't we do the third one, and then I want to come back. The third argument he makes in your objection, and then I do want to talk a little bit about church-state relationships, which you talk about quite a bit on this podcast, but fine-tuning kind of where, how we should think about both the difference between these institutions and yet where the waters meet, so to speak. So, what's the third argument that he brings?
Which one are you referencing?
Oh, did we already do that? Okay, I thought you said he had three arguments.
Well, he does, but the two are I separate them just for simplicity, which is he cites the spirituality of the church, but then he gets into the exception, and he argues that this case doesn't meet the exception because it doesn't directly affect the church. So those two kind of go hand in hand. I mean, there's more I could say about his position here.
Well, okay, yeah, that's fine if you have something to say. I thought it would be helpful also to just get into principally what
sure,
because there's a lot of pastors listening, I'm sure, and laymen in PCA churches who they don't know, they're confused. We'll put it that way, or if they're not confused, they're wondering where to lean, because in the one hand, we have, and maybe I should just say it. I can say it on my podcast. You have ministries. They're not, you know, Moscow isn't in the PCA, but the Moscow kind of model, if you want to call it that, of, you know, starting all these different institutions, publishing companies and media and all these things, and then addressing tons of political issues, right? And so there's a lot of involvement in civil affairs, or at least in commenting on them, and encouraging people to run for office, and I don't know what all, you know, they're doing, but that's kind of like one model I see, and that affects a lot of PCA churches, because I think you and I talked about it at breakfast a few weeks ago, that they're you know, they have the Canon Press app and stuff. Like, they may go to a PCA church, but like, what kind of material are they consuming at home? The material that's available, and they're not going on PCA sermon websites as much as they are, you know, the convenience of the Canon Press app with its kids programming and all the rest. So that's like one model that's kind of, you know, rising in popularity, I'd say, in the PCA. And then you have kind of this Westminster Escondido, radical two kingdoms, like very much a separation, which is what you're critiquing in a sense, aspects of it, between the government and the church, in such a way that the waters just never seem to meet. And it strikes. So there seems, I hate to be that guy that sounds like a typical evangelical who's trying to say there's truth in both, right? I don't know that I buy that, but I do see that you can go off in either direction, right? You can have a church that's electioneering, that's way too involved in cultural things to the point that they've lost their distinction as a church, which is more of a an outpost in the temporal world to point towards heavenly realities and prepare the soul for these transcendent heavenly things. And you're just so stuck in the temporal world and the political fights that are going on around you. I can see that as a problem. And churches that start putting things in their faith statements on, not political or moral issues, but like political strategies, like this is the right political strategy to end, for homosexuality or abortion or all these other things. Like they get sucked into a very political mold, or that at least the danger is there perhaps. And then you have the churches that just, 2020 happened and there's a riot outside the window. And the church says, we're not even going to address that. And we're not going to write any vaccination, religious conviction statements for your job, or we're going to pretend like none of that is happening. So give us some guidance as a pastor on how you navigate these two models and where you see the ditches and that kind of thing.
Yeah, this is kind of a tough question. I'll say I affirm the spirituality of the church. So I in one sense, it kind of is like a middle ground, but though I think it's the proper biblical teaching. And basically, it's the idea that the church is a non-secular, non-political institution. Okay, it is a spiritual institution with a spiritual mission. So we shouldn't be seeking to get involved in purely political issues. So there, like I said, there are things we shouldn't be getting into. I don't think we should be, as a church, officially endorsing candidates and things like that. There's also practical problems with that. Obviously, it causes unnecessary division. But then obviously we don't want to act like the Bible has nothing to say to these issues, because especially today, a lot of these so-called political issues are not purely political, right? They're moral. They involve all sorts of moral issues, and the Bible does speak to them. And where the Bible speaks, so must the church speak. And that's part of the issue. Now, I realize sometimes things aren't entirely explicit from Scripture. And so sometimes there's, things that are implicit, and sometimes we have to apply Scripture. So let me maybe give an example. Obviously the Bible very clearly condemns homosexuality. And so it doesn't take much to get to the conclusion that same-sex marriage is immoral and the church should oppose it, and even condemn the state and call the state to repentance when it enables such. I guess you could say abortion requires a little more to get there. It's not as explicit, though I think it's good and necessary consequence of Scripture, to use the language of the Westminster Confession 1.6. Most Christians are in agreement on that abortion is immoral. Of course, you get some who are soft on it politically. I don't think the church needs to say what the punishment should be. I think that can be left to the state. I'm not saying, again, though, I'm not saying pastors can't or shouldn't write on these things. But some of those issues, it's best that the church courts don't address. And then, but we can say abortion's immoral, and the church should call magistrates to repentance to outlaw it. And those are kind of like maybe two of the easier issues, but you do have things like transgenderism and transgender surgeries that Scripture still speaks to, as far as Genesis 1 and male and female and these kind of things. So again, I think let me maybe say this about T. David Gordon's article. I think he's right that we should be cautious in how we approach political issues in our assemblies, and we don't want to be doing these things all the time. So he's right on that, in that regard. I think he's wrong in the specific application here, and his exceptions are not broad enough. He's taking too narrow of exceptions, and unjustifiably limiting the church in its prophetic witness. That's part of the issue, is the church does have a prophetic witness against moral evil.
Yeah. You say in the conclusion to the article, Gordon's argument against the PCA's petition to the civil magistrate to end transgender surgeries does not properly account for the church's duty to correct the magistrate when it does not fulfill its duty. Gordon rightly holds that the church should correct the magistrate when it does not protect the church, but that is not the magistrate's only duty. The magistrate is also to maintain piety, and as superior in the Commonwealth, the magistrate is to protect and provide for those under his authority in all things necessary for the soul and body. And then when the magistrate does not fulfill his duty, the church may intermeddle with civil affairs by the way of humble petition. So you talked about that already.
And a lot of that's quoting, a lot of those are quotations, partial quotations from the Westminster Standard.
Right.
So people may want to go read that themselves. You know, I mean, I do think this is the case where some Reformed people or even non-Reformed Christians might say, whoa, like, caring for the body, you know, and not just the soul, or body and soul, right? For the magistrate. And then the other thing I said in there is about maintain piety, right? The magistrate should maintain piety. All of that stuff is still in the American version of the Westminster Standard. So I'm quoting the American version, not the original, which had you know, some stronger powers, I guess, of the state in regard to religious things. So that gets into the whole Christian nationalism, you know, issues and related to R2K, Reform Two Kingdoms, or probably Radical Two Kingdoms. But again, I'm just saying that the magistrate has a duty here, and when it doesn't do that duty, the church it's permitted to call the state to repentance.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I don't see anything in the Westminster Confession that would prohibit this kind of thing. And the people who want to draw those lines, I don't know where exactly they're coming from as far as like what cultural milieu they were involved in that made them scared about this kind of involved, like in the Baptist world.
Example. Go ahead. You tell me, and then I'll tell you what Gordon thinks.
Well, I was just going to say the Baptist world, you kind of understand it to some extent because their whole story is like, oh, we were always persecuted. And that's why we really want some kind of like religious pluralism. And that kind of motivates some of them to argue that the magistrate should be so separate from the church that the two waters shall never meet. And I get it for them. For the Presbyterians, not quite as much. I don't know if it's the same motivation or if it's something else. But go ahead. You had a illustration.
Well, I mean, for some of these guys, the Radical Two Kingdoms guys, I mean, it's hard to know individual motives, but there seems to be a fear of, you know, offending unbelievers on some of these matters. So they'd rather the church just talk about the death and resurrection of Christ, justification by faith, all great things. Obviously, the church should be preaching those, but they don't want to get into some of these more controversial things, right? That might touch on the political or cultural issues that are, the problem is they're moral issues. And so they deal with the law of God. God's law speaks to these things, and so should the church. So I think there is a fear from some of these guys. But again, I can't always know when that's the case. At least their arguments tend to be, you know, they're going to Westminster Confession 31.4. I think they're wrong on that. But here's where I was going is Gordon has a fear, and he states this in the article, that when the church gets too political, it becomes liberal. So that's his fear, and he's appealing to the 20th century.
Yeah.
But I think he makes an error here, right? Or I'll at least say I disagree with him. He is correct that both the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches in the 20th century were making lots of political statements, and they were going liberal. The Northern Church before the Southern Church, but the Southern Presbyterian Church was going liberal, started really heavily in the 1930s. And then the PCA was formed in 1973. The PCA came out of the Southern Church. Background of the PCA. So Gordon thinks that these liberal or these political statements that the mainline churches were making were leading it liberal. But here's the problem. I think he's conflating the issues in assuming causation. The fact of the matter is that the mainline churches were already going liberal. They were abandoning the inerrance of Scripture. They were abandoning, God's prohibitions on divorce, right, which are pretty strict. They were loosening things like that. They were starting to ordain women. So so this isn't just political. There's all sorts of other issues at play. Yes, they were entertaining. Some of the liberals were entertaining communism and other evils. But this was more symptomatic, I think, of their liberalism. Not the problem wasn't that they were making political statements. That wasn't the cause of their liberalism. In other words, now here's another argument, and I make this point in the article, is that in the 19th century, the Presbyterian Church actually made lots of political statements, but they weren't liberal. I mean, there were disagreements between like the old school and new school, and debates over slavery and abolitionism. But the fact of the matter is, and I point out three cases or three examples, is that the Presbyterian Church made they petitioned the government over mail on Sunday, so the Sabbath mails controversy. And while you could argue that directly affects the church, that's not the only place they went. They actually, as I quoted in there, they were saying this was like 10 and then 1814. That's before any splits. So this is a united Presbyterian Church, American Presbyterian Church, and they're saying that the mail being delivered on Sunday is bad for society, right? That's one of their arguments. So it's not limited to, oh, this is harming the church. They're just saying actually Sabbath breaking is really bad for everyone, and so the magistrate needs to stop it. So that's one example. There's also the other example I give is slavery. There's the 1818 statement on slavery. Now, this wasn't a petition of the civil government, but the Bible does speak to the issue of slavery. So it was kind of a moderate position where they rejected abolitionism, but they were also calling for an end to slavery. And then they instructed the church regarding duties of masters and slaves, and even called for discipline if like Christian masters were splitting up families and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting statement. But you see that they're addressing what was definitely in one sense a civil affair, for sure. But it was also moral. So basically the church was saying, well, we need to address these things, but we can't go as far as to tell the state that what they should do here. And then the other issue I give is temperance, which that one's kind of complicated. And I don't really like that the church was getting involved in that one. Because it ended up leading, eventually to like the prohibition movement. But anyway, the point is that the Presbyterian Church has a precedent for speaking to issues that are political, but they're not purely political. And so, the PCA here was following, basically American Presbyterian precedent.
Zach, a thought came to my mind, and I'd be curious to hear your thought on this. But there is a posture that is suited for perhaps a revolutionary moment that is not suited for a counter-revolutionary moment. And what I mean by that is you see the reform movements of the 19th century. You mentioned abolitionism and the prohibition issue, but of course you also had anti-Masonry, and you had the whole feminism issue coming up, and there were other things that there was just a whole kind of enthusiasm during the latter half of that century for these different reform efforts that culminated in the social gospel. And the Presbyterians were certainly involved in these things. I mean, even Finney came out of a Presbyterian background and was very enthusiastic about much of this. So
he did not hold the Presbyterian doctrine, though. Let's be clear. Actually, he
you don't want to take credit for him. That's fine.
Well, there's a funny story where he's asked about the confession, and he said he had never read it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't know how he got ordained, but he left in
Okay, all right,
1835.
okay.
So
But he did come out of a
he did. Yeah, Presbyterians, there's all sorts of bad figures that have come out
right.
of our ranks.
Okay, so all right. So anyway, here my point is though, in that moment, what you had, I think, with a lot of that, with that whole kind of I don't know what to call it, a broad movement. It was really like the first woke movement. Like if you could draw a lot of parallels. That woke movement, if you want to call it that, with all its broad kind of issues that it took, kind of had this revolutionary impulse. And it was the attempt to remake society along more egalitarian lines for the most part. That's really the common thread that runs through a lot of this, that there's these associations and institutions and things that are holding society back from progress. And that progress is going to eventually end up in some kind of a social equality. And so, of course, the social gospel is where this culminates. And we see that as compromise. And I think we could probably take these issues and talk about, hey, what was the biblical instinct they should have had and that they didn't, and that kind of thing. But that was a revolutionary moment. We're in a moment now where conservatives and Christians, in particular, who actually believe the Bible and make up the base of conservatism in this country, their job is more, or their impulse and their posture is more counter-revolutionary. They're looking at all the damage that's been done and they're trying to undo it somehow. And that's what you have here. It's an example of, hey, the government should be condemning and making illegal these transgender operations. This is a counter-revolutionary move. And so my theory, perhaps, that I'm coming up with on the spot is that maybe some of these PCA guys are looking back at moments that, more conservative ones, and saying, hey, we really went off track during that revolutionary moment when we overrode scripture. We overrode even some of the things that were prudentially perhaps better for society, or if they weren't better, we basically adopted cures that were worse than their diseases and that kind of thing. And we did all of this in the name of this impulse that really isn't biblical. You don't find this in scripture. And we're doing the same thing now. They're paralleling these things perhaps in their minds, or there's a fear that we're going to go, and it's a different moment though. And that's part of it. You're just applying biblical orthodoxy and moral standards in scripture to a range of issues that have been brought to us by the revolution. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as I'm talking, but I wonder if that's at play.
I have one thought, which is who's behind the overture, the petition to the civil government in this case against transgender surgeries. It's mostly the conservatives in the PCA, or who people would call the confessionalists, or whatever you want to call us. Those opposing, by and large, seem to be more progressive. So, and they say they're against transgender surgeries and all these things, but they're kind of citing the spirituality of the church. Again, I mean, there seems to be a fear. Some of those guys are not like in the same vein though as T. David Gordon. Gordon is not a progressive,
right?
So that's where there's a weird mix here, and it's like Gordon does seem to follow more of a radical two kingdoms position. So, and this is, I guess, a problem to raise, is the R2K guys, though they may be more politically conservative, are giving, they're giving arguments to more progressive people who are just afraid of speaking on these issues. So right? I mean, so these things get mixed, and I'm saying, so R2K is a problem. It really is.
But you're saying it's to my little theory that I came up with. You're saying it's actually not so much conservatives who are concerned about this involvement. It's actually it's a mix of progressives and conservatives. That line doesn't seem to be the I guess it doesn't define where you're going to land.
Some conservatives think that way. Like that's Gordon's thought, is that
right.
This is just going to lead to the liberalization of the church. And I think it's exactly the opposite. The church is actually trying to do its job, and it's the conservatives who are pushing this. So there's no risk of the PCA, going liberal, because I mean, the PCA has problems, but it's not because we're trying to petition the government on transgender surgeries. I mean,
seems like something not to be as concerned with. So I do have some comments coming in before we get to the David French stuff, which we're gonna do. So I'll just go, I guess, in order and see. Oh, this is I probably read the French stuff, so we'll get to this. I don't know what he's actually reacting to. We're all neo-Confederates, and so it's just like, I guess, so it's justified. So French. This is in response to French coming in and doing what I don't really remember exactly what it is. It's some kind of like a seminar. So
what the PCA is doing?
Yeah, they're bringing French in to do a seminar.
Yeah, they're like these pre-assembly seminars, and so it's I think it's on the Wednesday morning. So it's during the assembly. The assembly starts on Tuesday afternoon. So it's part of the assembly. Look, not everybody goes to these things. It's at 8 a.m. Business starts at 9 a.m. So people may still be sipping their coffee.
It's how to be supportive of your pastor and your church leaders in a polarized political year. David French is one of the speakers, and Randy Hicks, David Kaufman, Paul McNulty. I think Woke Preacher Clips was saying one of these other guys is pretty woke too.
I don't know much about, or actually I can't say I know anything off the top of my head about McNulty and Hicks. David Kaufman's a pastor, and I don't know all of his views on everything, but I will say he's a good man, and he's respected. But French in there with him, I mean, none of these guys are like clear. None of these guys would be open Trump supporters or
right.
I mean, even I doubt any of them are like paleo conservatives. It's probably a more neoconservative panel. Obviously, we'll get to talking about French, but let's just say here, even the topic is a problem. How to be supportive of your pastor and church leaders in a polarized political year. Look, I'm a pastor. I am concerned with what congregants think and how can I help them think more biblically in these matters. I don't need somebody worrying about me as a pastor. I mean, this is just so soft, frankly, that we're worried about. I mean, who's this even to? I mean, most of the people, by the way, at the assembly are teaching elders or ruling elders. There are some outside of that.
Right.
So this just doesn't even make sense. Why are we, I mean, even the audience, but again, this is kind of the typical thing, like just worried about supporting the pastors. And look, I mean, obviously some of these pastors are not very conservative politically. I don't think that's the majority, but you have some of them that I've definitely interacted with. I don't know. This just seems kind of ridiculous to me to be concerned about the pastor during political politicization or whatever we call it. And then you're going to bring in David French, who is obviously polarized. So there's ridiculous irony in there as well. So
it's in just so people understand the context of that comment. So you had posted David and Nancy French don't even like the PCA, and it's there's some article here where I guess one of them.
This is from April. It's pretty recent. It was on Nancy French. Yeah.
Right. So she says that no church is perfect, but I doubt they're brimming with neo-Confederates, and so they left the PCA, I guess, over this.
So the Frenches, just to be clear, the Frenches were members of a PCA church.
Yeah, and now they're not.
And they left, and as far as leaving, Nancy, David's wife, has some, kind of nasty words for the PCA. So
the hysterical thing about all of this, and I showed you this last night, is that you go back a few years. Now it's 9 years, I guess. 2015, David French in National Review, don't tear down the Confederate battle flag. June 19th, Nancy French in Pathos, why we shouldn't tear down the Confederate battle flag.
That's hilarious.
And this is so anyway, all these PCA people are these horrible neo-Confederates. We got to leave this denomination. But then, by the standards of the F scale today, the left, and the F scale just means the fascist scale, the left uses today. No, that's from I think Adorno, who had thought like, hey, if you respect your parents too much, you might be a little fascist or something. So like they have their scale. Like today. There's a guy, I don't know if he's PCA or what, I think he's Presbyterian, but he was like, John Harris is a slavery apologist and all this stuff. And I was like, you know, arguing with these people is kind of a fruitless endeavor. You can prove to them that they're wrong in every which way, but they just keep, like, as a broken record, saying the same thing. So, you know, my have times have changed 9 years, and they're complaining about all these neo-Confederates who are probably inspired by their own articles, you know, in 2015. And so anyway, that's why I think Daniel is like, we're all neo-Confederates in the PCA.
Yeah, let me comment on that briefly. Is I mean, it shows you how far the Frenches have fallen, apparently. I mean, it's kind of a similar to the gay marriage stuff, where, you know, David French was initially opposed, but now he's, you know, he doesn't necessarily endorse gay marriage, but he seems to he like says it's a civil right, or I don't know what language he uses. It's ridiculous though, the fact that he's defending it. Just so it just shows you. I mean, here's my word for David French: compromised. The guy is totally compromised.
Yeah, that's like it's a joke.
Yeah, I mean, he's a sellout, right? He was a Presbyterian, and I don't know how else you look at him and say otherwise, and that he's sold out for money. The guy is now writing for the New York Times. He wasn't a New York Times writer, but now he is. Well, that means he earned it, and he earned it by betraying fellow Christians and attacking them constantly in his articles.
Yeah, which
are posted on Sundays, by the way. I mean, we're the PCA is a Sabbatarian denomination. So this guy is like an open Sabbath breaker, and promoting, you know, his work on Sundays, and then we're going to invite him to address us as Presbyterian pastors. And yes, I'm well aware that there's lots of guys who take exceptions on the Sabbath, but they're not supposed to be taking entire exceptions to the whole doctrine, but just some of the, you know, kind of some aspects of it. But so this guy is just totally unsuitable to address the PCA. It's really making a mockery of our denomination. But to come back to the Confederate thing, the PCA is a Southern denomination. It came out of the Southern Presbyterian Church, the old PCUS. So, and I realize that brings up, you know, a lot of things and causes some problems for people. But I mean, because this gets into, well, what do they mean by neo-Confederates? Well, what, people that honor their ancestors, like uphold the Fifth Commandment? They're neo-Confederates. I mean, nobody ever defines this. Like, you like the old Confederacy, you like Southern authors. I mean, so my thought is, if you don't like the South, then don't be a part of the PCA, which is highly concentrated. Yeah, Machen was a Southerner. I mean,
you're a neo-Confederate if you like Machen. That's my
Machen thought. Yeah, well, this goes at some of the OPC guys, but Machen started the OPC, but Machen was a Southerner by background, his both parents, and he favored the Confederacy. He thought secession was legal, because it is, and you know, so what, Machen? So you like Machen, now you're a neo-Confederate? I mean, this is just silly.
Well, why not? That's all I'm saying, is why not?
Yeah, like, yeah. I mean,
why aren't David and Nancy French neo-Confederates for defending the Confederate flag?
So well, they are, by their own definitions.
By their own, yeah, probably are. This self-hatred. So going through the comments, we all, I think we are all David French. We all have David. I don't know what word to supply there. We all have David French on the mind. Why does the PCA invite someone to speak who constantly accuses the brethren to the pagans? Yeah, good point. Good point. Correct.
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, let's say I don't know exactly who made this decision. I'm hearing it was maybe our stated clerk, which is Brian Chappell.
Mm-hmm. Well, did you see today?
He should know about it at minimum.
Did you see Megan Basham? I should probably find it. Did you see the back and forth between them today on social media? Between Megan Basham and Brian Chappell. I think it was Brian Chappell. No, not Chappell. Sorry, not Chappell. The other guy. I'm gonna look it up.
Was it Cassidy?
Yeah, I think it was Cassidy.
Oh, yeah, Cassidy's like a progressive in the PCA. He blocked me a long time ago when he was calling, like, he was to ban guns. So he's obviously a political leftist, I think.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's just keep going. So you got another this is interesting point. People like me from the north who grew up in liberal home and came to faith later in life are Southern evangelical neo-Confederate. So he's saying basically, I'm part of the PCA, and they're, I'm in this, and they're just kind of broad brushing the whole thing. Scott says, get Doug Wilson to speak on the panel.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
That would be. I would like temporarily pay, like if there was a fee that I could like be in the PCA for just a day to come and attend that panel with David French and Doug Wilson. I would totally do it. But hey, why not? You're gonna have David French. Why not Doug Wilson? Like you really have no reason at that point. What bothers me is not that they petitioned the state on this evil issue, but that the PCA got plenty of pastors sympathetic to gays. I mean, this is a much bigger issue. And this kind of thing, I saw a bunch of comments along these lines, like going back and forth with whether or not the PCA is embracing of same-sex attraction and that kind of thing, which that seems to come up every year. And my understanding from talking to you last time was actually things are going in a better direction, it seems like.
So, yes.
So not there and stuff.
Yeah. The downside is that the PCA was never able to formally discipline anyone over what's called side B Christianity, which is basically they held that homosexuality in practice is wrong, but the desire is not sinful.
Right.
So, our standards teach that it is sinful. So it's not really, in one sense, we didn't need to have a ruling on it, but it is kind of like drawing out the from the text of the confession and catechisms. But we have had some good overtures, and even some that are passing with flying colors this year that they don't always explicitly deal with side B, but they are putting it into like our Book of Church Order, as far as like standards being above reproach and some of these things, and regarding sexual morality. So I think things are fine there. I'm not aware of anyone advocating side B in the PCA. And
that's a good change. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, if obviously we would have liked things to get dealt with in the courts to some extent, but Greg Johnson leaving is a big deal. Yeah. And he's trying to join the EPC, I believe, this summer. We'll see how that goes.
Cool. Yeah. Anyone who has questions, let me know. I'm just putting comments and questions. Not all of them, but ones that stand out. And I'm pitching them to Zach here. I'm at Greenville Seminary. We know the pulse in the PCA. It is not at that the stage of abandoning the ship. So Greenville, you've told me Greenville's a better one, because someone is saying RTS is pumping out woke pastors. So you have that going on in the comments. People say,
well, here I'll comment on that if you want.
Bad, Greenville good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an RTS Jackson grad. I think RTS is just broader, as far as seminary, and you also have different seminaries. You have different campuses. The Jackson one was kind of always known as the most conservative. Then you have Charlotte, and then like you have New York and DC. I mean, these are not conservative places. So yeah, I'm not surprised that even their professors, even if they're part-time, some of these guys are appreciating David French. I saw this Erwin Ince. He's the director of MNA, Mission to North America in the PCA. And he was, let me see what I have here. I took a picture so I could recall it. He said, I'm looking forward to this seminar and discussion. It is much needed. Now, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I saw
needed. Who's that? Who needs it? I don't need it. These guys need support. I mean, here's what I think happens in the PCA sometimes is pastors tend to be more progressive than both the ruling elders and then their congregants. That's not to say there's no woke congregants, members of any of these churches or anything like that. And there's churches that are more progressive. But I mean, I'm a pastor and I'm conservative. So I don't have this problem. My church is, fairly conservative. But sometimes you get these pastors who feel like, they don't want to touch on any of these issues. They don't want to take stands, and they might have pushback from the ruling elders and maybe people in the church. And so then they get frustrated. I mean, I guess they're the ones needing support. I would encourage them to maybe hold views more in line with the majority of the PCA, which is more conservative. We're a theologically conservative denomination. We don't take official stands on politics, but when it comes to like cultural issues and social issues and the like, we should be fairly conservative. I don't understand the disconnect.
Yeah, I don't either. We got DL Craig saying R2K theology is, and that's radical two kingdom, or what they say, reform Q kingdom, right?
Yeah, so that's what they call it. But it's not what it's not what the reformers held. So it's not radical, or it's not reformed. It is radical.
R2K theology is spreading fast in our PCA church in northern Michigan. Observation reveals that R2K allows cowards to be cowards while pretending to be bravely standing for something. Yeah, that's a good observation.
Yeah, I might know which church that is. That's my home state. But.
PCA member here. My church is getting more and more conservative. Not sure if we are the exception. There's so many mixed comments in this.
Look, the PCA is just very diverse in this regard. And I guess one thing to say there is it is the biggest conservative reform denomination by far in America. It's, somewhere around 400,000 people.
Yeah.
People talk about the OPC. They've only got 30,000 people. They're small. They're like a micro denomination. So the PCA is the biggest game in town. That's why it's important. And that's why it's important that we win. Mm-hmm. And if people aren't in agreement with, conservative theology and morals, then they can go somewhere else. They don't have to be a part of our denomination.
I think, but the SBC and the PCA are often compared, just like what stage they're at. And I used to think like they were kind of neck and neck. It was hard to say, but it seems to me the SBC is farther down the path at this point of I think they've actually gone, like they're over the cliff at this point, and it's just a matter of time. They're falling. The PCA, I said this the other day, that it seems like they're teetering. And so some people, presumably, and I should expect this, they took they objected to that, saying one way or the other, it's over the cliff, and then other people saying, no, it's great, it's conservative. Like Johnny here says, the PCA is going apostate. So it's there's just this. All right, a few more comments. Basically, the modern 2K guys seek a definition of cases extraordinary so narrow that no case will ever be extraordinary enough. Yeah, it's like when is it? Is it when the cannibals are eating children? Like when is it like, well, now the church can say something about it, but not until then.
Yeah, I mean, here's how I take extraordinary is it's not to be the ordinary practice.
Yeah.
I mean, so that I don't think it's that complicated, but it gives some leeway to the church. It's a prudential issue. We shouldn't be doing it all the time, but it leaves it to the assembly in this case.
If conservative denominations go woke, Eastern Orthodoxy and papism will keep growing. I don't know about that, because both of those traditions seem to have their own woke problems, to be honest with you. Yeah. And then signing on late. Is there a way to remove French from the panel and identify who invited him? So,
look, people have been flooding Brian Chappell's email inbox with, people complaining about this. And so I think that's good. Keep doing that. I don't know what Chappell or whoever was thinking when they decided to bring French in, or even just signed off on it, because you have to know the guy's polarizing. And if you don't know that, I think that just tells you how out of touch you are with American Christianity, and particularly the PCA. Obviously, the PCA, and I think you can say the majority of our pastors and elders don't like David French. They don't. They consider him. Sign. I mean, how many articles has David French written attacking evangelicals or white evangelicals, or whatever language he uses, for voting Republican, supporting Donald Trump, even though it's not like we have a lot of other options. So I think that needs to be factored in. And then so he attacks us for voting Republican, and then they leave the PCA now and call us a bunch of neo-Confederates. So I mean, and then they've defended Drag Queen Story Hour. So if I can say one other thing about French, is just, this guy's an enemy of the church. He doesn't encourage the church. He attacks us constantly, and he's aiding our enemies. which, I mean, let's face it, the Democratic Party hates Christianity overall. Maybe there's some exceptions, but their policies are anti-Christian. That's not an endorsement of everything the Republican Party does, of course, but I have plenty of complaints about the Republican Party. But
so this is someone said, I guess they did email Chapel, and you will just get a form letter back, as I did late yesterday. So
yeah, that's what I've heard.
Yeah, you're just getting form letters. So sounds like they're gonna go full steam ahead.
Well, I don't know. He may need to decide here. I mean, I don't know why David French would want to show up, because I can guarantee you a lot of people aren't going to go.
He gets to address a neo-Confederate audience, and he doesn't have that all the time. I mean, most of the time he's just writing to a bunch of Yankees in the New York Times. So what's Pastor Zach's position on having the PCA make more public positions on social moral issues such as opposing transgender surgeries and pronoun misgendering identification?
Well, I think we've done enough here on the transgender surgeries. I don't know about the pronouns. I mean, I think the pronouns are silly, and that we shouldn't comply. But I don't know what would be the proper. I mean, I don't think there's a legal issue there yet. It's more how employers enforce things. So yeah, I don't know if we need anything specifically on that. Though maybe people could use some guidance. I don't know, for a position paper or something.
Zach, how would you respond to a senior pastor who thinks never Trump because Christian nationalism is the most dangerous issue in the election?
Well, one, I don't think Christian nationalism is a danger at all. I actually think it's good. So I mean, I've defended it before, in that, it depends what we mean by it. But if we're just talking about, wanting a Christian nation with Christian morals and laws, I mean, I don't know how as a Christian you could oppose that. You could have criticisms of Trump. That's fine. I mean, I don't think we need to have a official position on Donald Trump, but yeah, if our options are Joe Biden or Donald Trump, I mean, I don't know. It seems pretty easy to me.
Sounds like the PCA seminar is for you, Zach. You need to understand these things.
Yes.
Someone says that, I guess you're full of it. I love Zach, but much of the rot has not been removed. So they're quoting. By Faith magazine apparently talks about this.
So. Well, but By Faith's a good example. By Faith is an organ of the PCA administration. It doesn't represent necessarily the majority of the pastors or members of the PCA. So this gets into a broader issue. Is we have kind of an administrative level of the PCA, bureaucracy, you could even call it, and it's more progressive, and it's at odds with, I think, the majority of the PCA. And so that's why this is maybe confusing to people, as people see, well, David French is being brought in, the PCA is going, liberal, and it's like, well, who brought him in, and who's supporting this? Not the majority of pastors in the PCA. So there's just some disconnect there. I just think it was a very poor decision, whoever made it.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll probably, there's other questions coming in, but we've been going over an hour, so I want to be respectful.
If I could just say one thing about French, is that I think is a problem. Just one last thing to add is he calls himself like a civil libertarian. Mm-hmm. I believe he calls himself that, but really he's defending libertinism. And that's the problem in all of this, is he's enabling, a lot of these wicked practices, whether it's drag queen story hour or, same-sex marriage, all of these things. And so he's not some neutral player in all of this stuff. He really is siding with the left. And that's why he's such a problem. I mean, because people are trying to act like he's just a moderate neutral, and that's just false.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that about him. That's part of the problem with bringing him in.
Yeah. No, that's good. Where can people go if they want to pre-order your book, or I don't know if it's even available for that, or and anything you want to plug?
Yeah, I don't even know how to get my own book yet. So
okay, well, there's that.
New Christendom Press. Look, just I'm sure there'll be announcements on Twitter and the like when it's ready for
sale
or pre-order.
Zach on Twitter, I guess, and that's
I'll post about it. At Zachary Garris.
Yeah. At Zachary Garris is the Twitter handle there. All right. Well, thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. God bless.
Yeah, thanks for having me. God bless.